It's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I think I'm the last speaker of the evening, which is not exactly where you want to be on the agenda. So when you're in this position, there are two really important things that you have to do. Number one is show a cartoon. So I actually have a cartoon that I want to show at some point. Number two is to have a little bit of audience participation. So we're going to start off with a question. How many of us have just this year, say, heard a CEO of a large enterprise say, we're a technology company? Raise your hands, please. Hands up. Look around the room. Okay, this is a solid, keep your hands up, please. Solid majority. Keep your hands up if you believed them. Yeah, here's what I think they meant. We're now in a technology industry. The person might have said, look, I didn't sign up to run a technology company. I thought I was going to run dog food or cement or something. But because of this force of digitalization, here I am confronted with all of the things that a technology company is confronted with. Faster pace of innovation, shorter product life cycles, barriers to entry and competitive moats that I was relying on vanishing pretty quickly. I am now in a technology industry. Doesn't feel comfortable in a lot of ways, so I had better learn how to run a technology company. So the question that I've been diving in on, and the reason I am finishing up a book called The Geek Way, is because when you try to run a technology company, you very quickly realize that if you're in a technology industry, you are suddenly competing against the geeks. Is this a term used in Germany? Kind of familiar with what I'm saying? It means a couple different things. The loose way that we throw it around is you are way too into computers. And that's true, there's a lot of geeks who are into computers. But in the past few years, the word has took on kind of a different atmosphere, a different definition. And when I'm using it, I mean two things. I mean, first of all, the person goes deep on something, whether or not it's computers. Very often it is. But there are Star Wars geeks and chess geeks and space geeks and all kinds of geeks all over the world. And the first defining characteristic of a geek is that they are willing to dive deep on a problem. They get kind of obsessed with it. They go to first principles, they go to root causes, and they kind of fiercely work at the problem until they come up with what they think is a good solution to it. The second defining characteristic of a geek is that they are willing to be unconventional. It turns out that the way we were using the word in America 50 years ago had nothing to do with high IQ or computers or anything. Geeks were people that went around. Did you all have like weird circuses that went around small towns in Europe 50 years ago? Some people in this room are old enough to remember whether or not that happened. In America, we had these weird small circuses that would go around the country to small and medium-sized towns, and they had a tent that was full of very strange things. One of them was a geek. And the geek was literally a person who would do things like bite the heads off of living chickens. I'm not making this up. This is what geeks did in the post-war decades. And so the term got drilled into us as a synonym for a true outsider. This is somebody who's not part of the mainstream. And that carries over to today. Geeks are people who are willing to go against the grain, to be unconventional. Jeff Bezos has this great way to say it. He said early in one of his shareholder letters, we are willing to be misunderstood for long periods of time. So when you're competing in a technology industry, you are competing against these geeks, and they have two defining characteristics. They go deep on problems, and they care nothing for the status quo. And the reason I wrote the book and the phenomenon that I've been diving in on is what happens when the incumbents meet the geeks. What happens when industrial era companies and organizations get confronted with ones who look at things very differently, who are native from this era of digitalization. And I think the pattern is emerging, the pattern is becoming clear. And my message is, it ain't good news for the incumbents of the industrial era. I want to tell you one story, one of the favorite geeks that I came across when I was researching the book. This is Will Marshall. Will is a Brit, but he wound up working for NASA. And if there's ever an iconic industrial era organization, It is NASA, the American Space Agency. NASA did amazing things. It put the first human being on the moon. It has sent probes to every planet in the solar system. But NASA is a great, big, old, slow-moving, bureaucracy is not a nice word, but we should probably use it, industrial era bureaucracy. And one thing NASA is extremely fond of is planning. When NASA decides to do a mission, they plan out every single step of it, every component, every piece of gear, every test, everything that they're going to do. They plan it out in excruciating detail. And there are good reasons to plan things out in excruciating. You can't just kind of wing it with a satellite. Whether or not there's a human life on board, you don't want to wing it with a satellite. So NASA, over the decades, developed this elaborate planning process, double, triple checks and redundancies on everything, a huge amount of process, a huge amount of structure, a huge amount of hierarchy. And Will was working at NASA, and he started to say to himself, I think we're overdoing it. The lore inside the agency at the time was that you cannot have a mission to the moon, not a manned mission, a satellite mission. You cannot have a mission to the moon for less than $1 billion. And Marshall thought that was wrong. He thought it was so deeply wrong, he thought it was off by an order of magnitude. And he started going around saying to his colleagues and his superiors at NASA, I think we can do it for $100 million. And the response was a really, really clear, shut up. Go back to work. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. Luckily, he had a boss who was willing to give him a chance and willing to provide some cover and some support for him. So he and his colleagues had the chance to go test out their ideas. And instead of planning everything out, and instead of buying the approved space-grade component for everything, I'm exaggerating a little bit, they went down to Radio Shack, they went to Amazon, they bought a bunch of components, they started slapping things together, and they tested the lunar landing module. They built a little skunk works in a hangar, and they tested the hardest part of the mission, which was the process by which you bring that thing down to the lunar surface without destroying it. They built one of those that they could test for $300,000. And at that point, the NASA brass, the bigwigs at NASA, went on a tour, and they walked by this, they called it Area 51, literally. And they got a demonstration of this landing test facility that cost less than $500,000 to build. And at that point, to their credit, the bosses of NASA said, all right, fine. You don't get $1 billion. We're going to give you $80 million, see what you can do. And they put a satellite on the moon for that kind of money. Won an award, everybody was really happy with it. There was kind of this big win for NASA. Marshall and his colleagues were not happy with it. They weren't nearly done. And they kept on asking these uncomfortable, unconventional geek questions along the lines of, why does it have to take so long? Why does it have to be so expensive? And in particular, they say, you know what? The bill of materials, if you look at what is in a communications satellite that we put up in space to send imagery back to Earth, and you compare it to the bill of materials in this, there's about 90% overlap. This thing has a camera. It has a GPS system in it. It has accelerometers in it, so you know where it is. It has a radio in it. It has a lot of what you would want in a communications satellite. And so he had this extremely geeky idea to launch a smartphone into space and see if it could send an image back down to Earth. I don't mean like a smartphone, I mean a smartphone. He put a phone on a rocket. When NASA found out, they almost denied permission, they almost fired him, but they let it go ahead. And so this smartphone went up into space, and Marshall activated this network of space geeks and imagery geeks around the country, and he told them when to go to their backyards and wave their antenna around and get the packets down from the phone as it was trying to transmit them. They emailed whatever packets they came across back to Marshall and his colleagues, and they stitched together the first imagery that came back down to the Earth's surface from a smartphone. And at that point, Marshall really started to make friends at NASA because he said, this thing costs on the order of $500. A communication satellite costs $500 million. What are those extra 6 zeros doing for us? At that point, the relationship really became unrepairable. So in best geek fashion, Marshall went off and he started a company called Planet Labs. And he now puts up satellites. They're about, a third of a meter on each side. They cost about 3 orders of magnitude less than NASA is used to. And he puts them up and they send imagery back down to the surface of the planet. They scan the planet Earth every day. And Planet makes that imagery available to all kinds of different customers, for industry, for environment, for defense, for security purposes. They have a lot of customers for imagery about the Earth. But what they do is do it cheaper, faster, and yes, better than was the case before. And so when I interviewed Marshall, I said, okay, what are the biggest differences between the way you work now and the way you worked when you were at NASA? He said, when I was at NASA, I was part of about half a dozen launches. And he said that was prolific. There are many people who are engineers at NASA, and they participate in about 1 or 2 launches in their entire career. So he said I was already kind of working at a high clock speed by NASA standards. He said I was there for 10 years. I was part of 6 missions, 6 launches. Now at Planet, we launch every 3 months. And we put up between 20 and 30 of our satellites. And if 2 or 3 of them don't work, we don't love it, but we don't care very much. We're happy that the rest work. We've built in that redundancy, and they're cheap, so we don't care. But more fundamentally, he said on every one of those launches, every 3 months, we put up an experiment. We put up a different camera, a different radio, some different sensor technology as an experiment, and if that works, the next launch has that technology baked into it. We are iterating and improving and experimenting on a 3-month time cycle, and that all of our innovations diffuse very rapidly up there in space. So I look at examples like that, and when I've been researching the book, I came across no shortage of examples of this kind of confrontation between the geek worldview and the worldview that dominated the industrial era. I've been at business schools long enough. I've been teaching from the industrial era playbook about how you build and run a great company. I think we should throw that playbook away because the geeks keep showing us that they can do it better. So far, I've provided exactly 1 data point about that, right? I've told a hopefully cool story about an engineer who got frustrated, not even at a company, but at a space agency, and went off and did something fantastic. Can I show more systematic data than that? I think I can, and now it's time for the cartoon. So this is a visualization. Cartoon's too fancy a word for it. This is a visualization of the 50 most valuable companies in America, in the world, in the year 2000. Most valuable by market capitalization public companies in 2000 throughout the world. There are 50 bubbles on this cartoon. The bubble is centered on the headquarters city of the company. The size of the bubble, the area of the bubble is proportional to the market cap in real terms of the company, distributed all over the world. And then the last thing to keep in mind, you'll notice there are kind of blue bubbles and kind of green bubbles. The green bubbles are in what we would call tech. And the intersection between tech and geek right now is very, very tight. So the green bubbles are what we would call tech companies. The blue bubbles are everything else in the global economy. Does that make sense? So now we're going to watch a cartoon. And I'm going to show how the distribution and the size of the 50 most valuable companies in the world has changed over the course of the 21st century. I want you to do me one favor, though. Please don't fall asleep in the first half of this cartoon, because you're not going to notice a ton of change in the first decade. You'll see the Great Recession. That unpleasant memory will show up. You'll start to see the oil age fade away. But to me, things get really interesting from about 2010 on. So keep your eyes on that. I think, how many of us would agree that the world's greatest concentration of geek right now is in Northern California? Is that a fair statement? Great. Let's keep our eyes on Northern California and watch what happens there. And finally, I think we've heard a couple times today, there has been a very severe market correction so far in 2022. It has hit tech disproportionately hard. So I need to include the most recent data that I can. I'm going to include a 2022 frame at the end of this cartoon with the most recent data that I have, which is from earlier in May. Got it? All right, let's watch a cartoon. Again, please don't fall asleep yet. All right, to me, this starts to get kind of interesting. So that's after the tech pullback. That's almost current prices for these companies. So you look at that period, this is 20 years, this is not a huge amount of time. And I see two pretty broad trends. One is a shift to the green, the other is a shift to the west coast of the United States. And at the start of our visualization, the US, I believe, had something like 60 to 2/3% of the total market cap of these companies around the world. By the end, the US is up to almost 80%, and Asia has gone ahead of Europe. Asia now has 12% and Europe 10% of the value that's left over. The final question that I want to leave you with, and then hopefully we'll have time for a quick question or two, is what's this graph going to look like in the future? If I come back in 10 years and show you another decade worth of the 50 largest companies in the world, what's it likely to look like? We get a clue about that. We don't have a complete answer, but we have a clue about that by looking at where the unicorns are distributed all over the world right now. So a unicorn is a private company valued at $1 billion, usually in tech. Let's see where the unicorns are. So we're going to do another map. This one doesn't have any animation, but that's the unicorn distribution. And that kind of tells me that we're going to see more of the same trend instead of a break in the trend in the years ahead. The unicorn distribution looks a lot like the big valuable company distribution, and my fondest hope is that I'm wrong about this, and that as we keep drawing these graphs, we see a whole lot more bubbles of all kind right here where we are right now, and we see Europe coming back from its current position. I've got 15 seconds left by this clock. Does somebody have a question that is both short and fantastic to round out the day? I'm serious, it has to be short, it has to be fantastic. Who's brave enough? Sir, it's over to you. Oh, that's the legend. That's not Peter Thiel's island of unicorns. That shows you what $500 billion looks like. That was quick. I don't know if it was fantastic, but it was clarifying, so we'll take it. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.